Going inside the issues of our community. This is Local 12 Newsmakers.
Good morning and welcome to Local 12 Newsmakers. Union Terminal, along with Fountain Square and the Roebling Suspension Bridge, are the region's most recognizable landmarks. Love of the building goes a long way to explaining the initial support of voters in May 1986 to convert the terminal into a multi-use facility. Since the ribbon was cut on the renovated facility in November 1991, the core experience that included the Cincinnati Natural History Museum, the Cincinnati Historical Museum, and the OmniMax Theater has been strengthened with the addition of a children's museum and an enlarged changing exhibit space capable of accommodating blockbuster traveling exhibits like the current St. Peter and the Vatican. Despite broad success, the Museum Center faces serious financial issues, many related to the cost of maintaining the aging, massive terminal building. To address these needs, the Museum Center has placed an operating levy on the March 2nd Hamilton County ballot. It will appear as issue 11. The proposed levy requests the adoption of 0.2 of a mil property tax that would generate $3.6 million a year, which would cost the owner of a house valued at $100,000 approximately $6 a year. To discuss issue 11, I am joined by Doug McDonald, the president of the Cincinnati Museum Center, and Chris Finney, a member of the Hamilton County Tax Levy Review Committee. Welcome to Newsmakers, and in both cases, welcome back.
Thank you.
Doug, the Museum Center, in the little more than a decade it's been open, on many levels has been incredibly successful. Lots of crowds, 1 million people a year. Any of us who have been down there since the Vatican exhibit has opened over Christmas know the place was jammed. Why is there a problem?
Well, I think it has been a phenomenally successful institution, and it's a great use of Union Terminal. I think the Cincinnati Museum Center realizes, like others, that that building itself, although an icon, a wonderful building, is just extremely expensive to maintain, and we've just never been able to put together the resources necessary for the museum operations to pay for all of the expenses associated with the building itself.
This is a building that opened in the early 1930s. What construction, what conditions in a 1930s building are different than what they would be today, besides just the age? Are there things that you face because that was built at a certain time?
Well, definitely the energy cost issues were a little different today versus the 1930s. And when they originally built the building, they didn't air condition it. Today, people really wouldn't come to a building that wasn't air conditioned. So you have those expenses. But we spend $700,000 a year on utility expenses. So that's more than a couple dollars. And there are repairs that need to take place that are very expensive, especially when you try and do them in a way that is keeping with the fact that it's a national landmark. And so trying to maintain those historical standards and do the repairs are a pretty expensive proposition.
Chris, your committee, you're a member of this review committee, Tax Levy Review Committee. When your committee got together to look at this proposal several months ago, what is it that you did to try to evaluate whether or not this was something you were going to recommend to the commissioners to put on the ballot?
Well, the Tax Levy Review Committee exists to advise the commissioners about whether something goes on the ballot or not, and our process includes hiring a consultant to study their operations and really deliberations to consider whether this is something that we as a community should be funding with tax dollars. And in the case of the Museum Center levy, we tried to both fit that within a formula that keeps taxes within the rate of inflation, which it appears we'll be able to accomplish this year, and in addition to that, to limit the length of the levy with the Museum Center. And they negotiated some benchmarks of performance to say that they don't think that this needs to be a permanent burden to the taxpayers. So it really was a thoughtful process where we tried to have the taxpayers at the table and to get the Museum Center to a point where they would be self-sustaining at the end of the levy period. In this case, no longer than 10 years is what's suggested. The specific levy that's on the ballot is 5, but they've committed that they won't come back for a renewal, or if they meet the benchmarks after a 10-year period.
And we'll talk about that more in a second. When you hired this consultant to come in, that consultant, as I understand it, evaluated budgets, evaluated staffing, evaluated the revenue side, et cetera, et cetera. And I suspect probably compared this to other similar institutions in other cities. How did the Museum Center come out on those sorts of issues about spending the money it's got responsibly?
Right. I think that the Maximus was the consultant, and the things that they were looking for is, do we have an efficiently run operation? Are there any things that we can do either on the revenue side or on the expense side to make it so that we don't need to have even the short-term tax burden from the Museum Center? And their findings were that it was very well operated, that it had low tax subsidy, tax input compared to other institutions. They have low operating cost on a per attendee basis compared to these other institutions, and there weren't a lot of buttons we could push to help the Museum Center out, except for the 0.2 mil levy that was approved by the commissioners.
So there weren't any big glaring things saying, if you change this, we can at least delay the levy.
I think, Doug, they found a couple nits with the parking and some other things, but in terms of finding big dollars that would really turn around the operations of the Museum Center, there was nothing.
Doug, Chris was just saying that this initial levy is for 5 years, and there's something of a promise that maybe come back for one renewal, so this may be a 10-year process, and then hopefully not need it. Why wouldn't you need it 10 years from now if you need it now?
It's really better for us, and if we can attract public support to grow our endowment, and that is really, it's a reliable revenue stream. It's something that a lot of museums in the country have substantially more endowment dollars than what we have. It's something that we can attack if the institution's financially stable, and if we're bridged for a period of time, we think we can raise that money. We believe that it's a good course of action. We know that the voters in Hamilton County are very concerned about the level of taxation, so we really wanted to put together a package and request to the voters that showed that we were being as sensitive about the tax dollars as what we know they are.
You know, people who aren't into not-for-profit world may not understand exactly how an endowment works. What's the size of your endowment now?
Our endowment's about $8 million today, and what we do with that is we take the income off of that and use the income from that endowment basically for operations. And so as we can expand that, and so very simple, we spend about 5%, is what our goal is, spend 5%. So if we raise $40 million, will generate for us about $2 million in revenues. So you just take those numbers and look at it. So you got to raise a lot of money to have that revenue level.
And why not make the commitment now just to go out and raise endowment rather than raise taxes?
Great question. We'd love to be able to do that, but the realities are that it's going to take us some period of time to do that. People make major gifts of $1 million or higher, but they plan for those. Those aren't something they just write a check out of their checkbook and just do tomorrow. And so it takes you a while to work towards that. And the other challenge is people give to institutions they believe are stable, and we have to stabilize this institution. Then people will invest because they invest with gifts that create a legacy. And the challenges of the cost of the building are such that right now people are fearful that their gift won't be a legacy gift. It will just help pay for the heat bill this year. And so we have to get past that first.
Yeah, and having done development work for not-for-profits, that's a basic point. As long as you're running a deficit, and you are running a deficit now, right?
We are running a deficit. We had 1 year where we actually balanced our books, but other than that, the building has really caused us to be in a deficit situation ever since we opened.
You keep coming back to the building. Chris, who owns that building?
Oh, I was afraid you were going to ask me that. It's apparently a combination of city and county ownership, and then under a lease with the Museum Center to run the operations there. But one of the things that really swayed me about the levy is I go back to the days when that was a shopping center and vacant for many, many years and who knows what else. And the reality is if we can't figure out a way for the Museum Center to succeed, we still have that landmark that's a treasure to our community that I wouldn't want to let go. And so then we have a liability instead of an asset there that we have to figure out a way to deal with. So this is a public asset. I would hope that it's going to be a part of the Cincinnati landscape for a long, long time. This is the best option I know to keep it viable and well maintained and really used in a way that brings a lot of people into that beautiful structure.
Chris, not asking you so much as a member of the Tax Levy Review Commission, but as Chris Finney, you do have a reputation of sort of being an anti-tax guy. I mean, I've had you on this show. Right? Yeah, I think you've got that. I've had you on this show many times because you frequently are really opposed to specific tax proposals. It is unusual for you. You're basically saying you're supporting this on a personal level, right?
There's no question about it. And I want you to understand that me personally and with Coast, what we have said is we want responsible tax policies for this region. And one of those is to keep taxes and spending within the rate of inflation and also to make our institutions as self-sustaining as possible without tax dollars. We've accomplished both of those goals with this levy proposal, with the commitment to be off of the levy within 10 years, and also with what else is going on within the levy structure. The zoo levy is down and the clear levy is dropping off this year. The voters are able to keep the tax rate within the rate of inflation, at least in 2004. With this particular proposal, we have to wait to see what happens this fall. We've got pressures all the time, but I've never taken the position we can't do anything. My position has always been we have to do things that are responsible, that don't increase the burden on the senior citizens on a fixed income, that don't increase the burden on families that want to come in and buy their first home. We have to figure out a way as a community to do more things with what we have than continuously increasing taxes. And this would be a perfect example of achieving those objectives in a responsible way without overburdening the taxpayers.
Doug, one of the things that people sometimes raise questions about is why should cultural institutions receive tax money? Why should the Museum Center, collection of different cultural institutions, why should you receive public funding?
Well, I think there's obviously lots of reasons, but in this case, this really is a public building. And what we are asking for is public support for a public building. And it really is an icon in this community. It's an important asset for our community. A survey by the University of Cincinnati found that this is the most highly recognized architectural structure in our community and the most highly appreciated. And so this really is about supporting the structure and recognizing that this is a great use of that structure. Around the country, you'll find that a lot of cities and communities have invested in cultural institutions because they know that cultural institutions are kind of the unique fabric of your city that create reasons for people to come downtown, that create a mixture of people throughout a community, and they're important assets, and so they've decided to invest in those in numerous public funding strategies.
What about for you, Chris? Is that a concern in your mind?
Oh, I don't think there's any question that we have to be careful to avoid the slippery slope that every institution that is in financial trouble thinks that they're entitled to tax dollars because of that. I think we've created a balance here with the Museum Center to do that, and I would not want to establish the idea that every institution that wants to get on the dole can do that. I don't think that's the case here.
One of the things, and you were a guest on the show, Doug, when you released this, there is real economic impact from your institution. I mean, this is not just a wonderful old building, and it's not just a few wonderful old museums. There's real economic impact here, right?
I think a lot of people don't realize there was over $76 million of economic impact by Cincinnati Museum Center's operations by themselves, which the University of Cincinnati in their survey said is that both our employment base and jobs generated through that economic activity is over 1,100 jobs in our region that are created. We do a lot of things that are helpful. When we bring an exhibit like the Vatican to Cincinnati, we bring people from throughout the region who come in. When they come here, they eat in restaurants, they stay in the hotels. That creates local commerce. Getting people from Columbus, Indianapolis, Chicago, Boston to come to Cincinnati and spend their dollars here is a net positive. So it really is a positive thing for the region.
There's always a question in these sorts of levy proposals, that tough question I have to ask. What are the implications if it doesn't pass?
Well, I think we are really optimistic and think it really needs to pass and believe that it will. we really cannot afford to lose an institution like Cincinnati Museum Center and to struggle with what it would take to try
I guess I'm asking the question. I know you're optimistic and you want to believe, but are there serious implications if it doesn't? Or is it just, oh, well, this is a little bit of a problem for you, but it would be nice to have the money?
Well, it is a serious implications. When you look at our balance sheet, which the Tax Review Committee did, and you look at what our assets are, and you look at what the deficit operations have been per year, it's Museum Center is in a very tough situation and really does need the support. It's a small tax, but it'll make a huge difference in the operations of Museum Center.
In other words, you can't run a deficit forever.
You really can't run a deficit forever.
Right. Okay, very good. We're going to be watching this on March the 2nd and see how it turns out, and thank you for being here this morning.
Thank you.
Stay tuned. After the break, music inspired by the Underground Railroad.
Is it me, Tom, or the baby? He is bound to sell us down the river to a death no one will see. His debt will be forgiven, but I will not be free.
Welcome back. A year ago, I interviewed Ann Hagedorn at the time of the release of Beyond the River, the untold story of the heroes of the Underground Railroad. The book focuses on abolitionism and the Underground Railroad in the central Ohio Valley, particularly as it's centered on the village of Ripley, Ohio. A year later, the book has sold nearly 60,000 copies, been named one of the 25 most notable books of the year by the American Library Association, won a host of favorable reviews, and has just been released in paperback. In the midst of Black History Month, it is a good time to talk with Ann and her partner Alan Schwartz about how they have taken the book to the public and what they have learned in the process.
Definitely one of the foremost things is the educational value of the Underground Railroad, because I feel that audiences really respond to the stories of these individuals on a personal level. And so because of that, because we can touch people on such a personal level through the stories of these very brave Americans, we can teach people about democracy, what it takes to make democracy work, the struggle for democracy. We can teach people about freedom, what people will do to achieve freedom, and also to include freedom in the values of American society, which is what the abolitionists were trying to do. And of course we can learn about race and race relations through the Underground Railroad, partly because the Underground Railroad smashes so many myths, especially the myth about the slave as the passive victim. Because, you know, through the Underground Railroad we see many, many slaves proactively undertaking their own liberation. The main thing, though, is that there's no way you can think about the Underground Railroad without thinking about whether or not you would have been involved in it. And when people start to reach that level, which they do 9 times out of 10, then they learn something about themselves and, I think, about their country.
In this past year, have there been stories that have emerged, details, information that has emerged that you wish you had known when you were writing the book?
Yes, I wish I had included more about the house we're sitting in right now, the McCaig house.
About 4 months after Beyond the River appeared, Ann and her friend Alan Schwartz bought the Front Street home of Thomas McHugh, a prominent antebellum Ripley pork packer and banker who was active in the effort to help freedom seekers.
Of all people in the Underground Railroad, he had to be the most secretive. And because his trade, his whole wealth, his empire depended on trade with the South. And so he could not be exposed. And yet Thomas McCaig is in many accounts. There are accounts of slaves being hidden in this house, accounts in the Rankin Sons letters, John Parker's interview.
The way you describe McCaig, do you think he was conflicted?
I think he was conflicted, and I think Thomas McCaig wanted to only work with fugitive slaves at night. And there is an account, maybe more than one account, there are two accounts where slaves come during the day. In the early morning, they didn't get beyond the riverfront by dawn. And he doesn't want them to come in, and the accounts are that his wife demanded it. That he said, I do not deal with this during the daytime, and she says, we accept fugitive slaves any hour of the day. So my feeling has been, and I've always had this feeling about the Underground Railroad, that the role of women has been, has been underplayed, and that there's a good deal of research to be done on the role of women in the Underground Railroad.
Whereas Ann expresses herself primarily through her writing, Alan is a visual artist and a musician. When it came time to plan the promotional tour, Ann and Alan decided to collaborate in the development of what they call the Road Show, a combination of readings and 4 original songs, which they have presented in over 150 different venues over the past year.
I've been very interested in finding those stories in history of people making decisions that really then generate the real feeling of the period and the factors that were involved.
One of the songs is written from the view of the slave Eliza, mulling over the decision to take her life into her own hands.
Well, mistress, she's so worried. At night she locks us in. She tucks away her conscience and she talks to me of sin. She says I am her property, that I cannot steal. She says the folks up north won't help me. Well, I pray to God they will. I'll take the creek down to the river, cross the river to the house on the hill. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. God knows I run, I will.
Alan sees the function of music and narrative history as complementary.
In the same way that history is a safer way to talk about decisions we have to make today, there's a suspension of fear when you talk about history or a story that allows people to continue to engage with the subject before, like in one of our songs says, I don't want to think about it because then what would I do? Before that kicks in, a story will allow you to go further, and so will music. So music is a good vehicle. People will listen to a story transferred in music without the fear that they're going to be put on the spot, which allows them to reflect a little longer.
Were there times when you did a public presentation that somebody in the audience challenged you, challenged your interpretation, challenged your point of view on something?
Oh, yes, I did. I did. A couple times, lawyers. It was always lawyers. A gentleman pulled me aside afterwards and said, do you realize, he said, I cannot respect these people. He said, I'm having a really hard time with this. I can't respect these people because they broke the law. And he said, I'm a lawyer, and I believe in the laws of my country.
What did you say in response?
The lesson is that as, what I told them was that as law enforcement officials, you enforce laws. I, as a citizen, obey laws, but we all, as citizens of a democracy, have the responsibility to scrutinize the laws. We have to do that, and that is the big, big, big lesson.
With 50 to 60,000 copies of Beyond the River already sold, and the book being released in paperback, Ann has moved on to another project that continues her exploration of the meaning of democracy.
It's another historical narrative which is about the aftermath of World War I, in which I am continuing what I have begun to feel is a quest of a lifetime, which is the exploration of what it means to live in a democracy, to be a good citizen in a democratic nation, what that means.
Ann Hagedorn and Alan Schwartz will present their road show across Ohio this spring as the featured speakers in the Ohio Forum, sponsored by the Ohio Humanities Council. They will be in Cincinnati at the Mercantile Library on March the 25th. You can get information at 513-621-0717. Thank you for making Newsmakers part of your Sunday morning. Next week, the 5 candidates vying to become the Republican nominee for Hamilton County Commission against incumbent Democrat Todd Portune. We leave you this morning with a segment from the song by Alan Schwartz about the decision faced in 1834 by Lowry Rankin about whether or not to become personally involved in helping slaves escape. Have a good week.
Should I defend her 'cause she's young? Should I defend her just because her crime is nothing that she's done? And is she that much more innocent than those darker souls in chains? Now I see what justice means. I want to drive that freedom train. Well, I could have been a man afraid to struggle, could have been a man afraid to dream, could have been